All right, looks like we are live. Good morning, good morning. As you join us, you'll see I'm just pinning a message to the chat, so go ahead and let us know your role and organization. When I start seeing a few results come in there, I'll know that we are live and that the session has started officially. Let's see, waiting for a couple of those to come in. So go ahead and let us know in the chat your role and organization, please. There we go. Thanks, Gerhard. Thank you, Sarah. Perfect. Looks like a couple of us are joining. Good stuff, good stuff. Thanks, Nick, for letting us know your role in organization. So for those of us who haven't already, thanks, Karin. Nice to see you in the room. A very long-standing friend in the CFO community. Thank you, Martine. Okay, excellent. We are definitely live. So welcome to another exciting edition of the Finance Indaba Network webinar series. We embarked on this journey a little over 2 months ago, and we've received incredible feedback based on some of the sessions we've already hosted. I'm seeing Ashley Kiefer and Prami. Nice to see some familiar faces and some long-standing friends of the CFO community in the room as well. Thank you all for being here. This morning, I'm super excited about our topic. We've got two heavy hitters in the finance space. We've got Gerhard Hartman, who is the VP of Medium Business for Sage Africa and the Middle East. And we've also got Arthur Goldstuck joining us, who's the founder and CEO of Worldwide Works. Now, what excites me most about the webinar this morning is there's a lot of very aspirational people in the CFO community, and we've embarked on a long strategic journey with Sage. We've seen the value that they're providing to some of their customers, and just to the finance profession as a whole. You'll find that as Arthur goes into more of the details around this extensive research of over 300 finance leaders, you'll see how relevant it is for you, either in your role as a senior finance professional, or perhaps you're in that sort of aspirational level where your eyes are moving up the ranks and moving into that CFO role. So what do you say we kick things off officially? I'm going to go ahead and get our slides up here now. So you can see in the middle of our screen is Arthur. We've got Gerhard over on the right. And let's go ahead and do our formal introduction. So there's Gerhard. You can see he's joining us here from Sage. We've got Arthur who'll be joining us. And I think Sage needs very little introduction to the finance community. I mean, let me just move this around here so we can see some of these stats. Let's make that a bit smaller. So there we go. We can see that Sage is already working with various organizations right across Africa and the Middle East. You can see they've got over 203,000 partners. So definitely a trusted brand and organization in the finance space. And I suspect that some of those brands and companies on our screen, we might even have a few attendees in the room here today who represent those organizations. Now, as this is your CFO community, this is all about you, and we want to make the session as interactive and engaging as possible. So over on the right-hand side of our screen, you'll see the chat. Please feel free to share your thoughts and your ideas. Pose any questions for both Gerhard and Arthur in the chat. We'll be sure to answer all of them. If we don't get around to answering some of your questions in today's session, we'll be sure to follow up with you within 24 hours with a response to some of those questions. And towards the end of our session here today, we'll also be entering into a live Q&A where you'll have an opportunity to present some questions or maybe even concerns to both Gerhard and Arthur. So at this point, Arthur, I'm going to hand over to you just to take a bit of a deeper dive into some of the research, and maybe you can give us a bit of the background and the context to the CFO 3.0 research. Tell us some of the amazing insights that you found and you experienced. And Gerhard, I'm going to jump off camera and I'm going to advise that you do the same so we can give Arthur the full spotlight here. Over to you, Arthur.
Thank you, John. Great to be speaking to the CFO community, especially because our massive research project amongst CFOs is so directly relevant to you. With Sage, we conducted a survey of 311 senior financial decision makers, primarily CFOs, and we put a range of questions to them in terms of their response to COVID-19, but also generally their use of technology, the cloud, and what technologies in particular had a role in evolving their role in the organization. So there were three broad areas that we uncovered and you could say demystified in a way. The first was looking at the CFO's evolving role in terms of how that role would be changing as a result of the digitalization of industries and the extent to which it has had an impact on their organizations and themselves for that matter. The second area was that broad question, what is keeping you awake at night? And the flip side or the corollary of that question is, how do you manage uncertainty in times like this? How do business priorities change? How do you ensure continued revenue growth? And then, of course, managing risk and compliance. But in the context of this research, how technology in particular has had an impact on that role. And then finally, are you riding the tech wave? How important are new technologies and are you adopting those? And that provided some of the most fascinating findings in our research. So broadly, the real bottom line of the survey was that it uncovered a massive shift in the role of senior financial decision makers as drivers of strategic change and the extent to which they have become visionaries of the future rather than only looking back at the past. And we'll unpack that particular finding quite extensively in the next few minutes. So in terms of how the role of the CFO is evolving, this slide really sums it up, where we asked the CFO to what extent were they responsible for digital transformation in the organization. If you had only asked that as a yes-no question, you'd think, well, 15% are fully responsible for digital transformation. That means that the CFO is not really that key to digital transformation. But when we asked additional questions like, to what extent do you play a role in digital transformation if you're not solely responsible for it? And most CFOs, 9 out of 10, agree that they play a key role in the digital transformation or the digital strategy of the organization. 87% played some role in that process and in digital strategy. So in other words, the CFO has become a key partner in digital strategy and digital transformation of the organization. And 86%, almost the same percentage, and that's no coincidence, believe that financial technology can unlock new opportunities. So the CFO is seeing themselves as playing a significant role in business strategy, in the role that the finance function has in business strategy, but also in the role that the CFO and the finance department has in digital transformation. So what you start seeing is an interlinking of all these functions and all these processes. You can no longer divorce the CFO from the digital side of the business or from the overall business strategy itself. So in that context, I want to ask you a question that we will then tie into the findings of the survey. I'd like to ask you, what has been the biggest disruptor in your finance department this year? And we came up with 4 main findings, and we want to see how this audience compares to the 311 CFOs that we surveyed. So which of these has had the biggest impact? Managing, leading, and or working within a remote team, in other words, managing remote workers. Changing stakeholder demands are having an impact on you. Compliance and cybersecurity concerns have been the biggest change, or financial analysis to support your organization's change. Which of those has had the biggest impact on changing your role? Or which of those represents the biggest shift in your role? Not necessarily which one is the most important in its own right, but which one represents the biggest change or the biggest shift in the role that you play.
Thanks, Arthur. And you'll see the poll displayed just above the chat, so go ahead and select the option which is most relevant for you. We'll give you about 30 seconds. And you should see those results coming through now, Arthur. I'm going to give people a little bit more time. Now I'm going to end the poll and ask you for some of your insights based on the research that you've done and how this group of finance professionals compare and stack up to what you've seen in the past. So I can see the dials moving there. Going to give you about another 10 seconds or so. So if you haven't responded, go ahead and do so now, please. All right. Here we go. Going to go ahead and publish those results. There we go. Let me know if you can see those results coming in there, Arthur.
Yes, that's fascinating to see how it shifted as people are answering the question. And managing remote workers comes out number one. 44% of respondents said that was the biggest shift in their role, followed by supporting the organization's efforts to navigate change. In other words, supporting the strategic direction of the organization. So that's number one and two. Stakeholder demands and compliance coming quite a lot behind those. And guess what? Managing remote teams came out absolutely number one in our survey as well, along with changing stakeholder needs and compliance and cybersecurity. And I'll show you what the numbers are. In our survey, 27% said that managing remote workers was the biggest shift in their role. We've only looked at the top two. On the left-hand side, the 27 and 21% represent this particular question. Number two was driving business strategy and objectives. Now, what's really fascinating about those, before I come to the other numbers that we show you here, is that had we asked this question a year ago, the idea of managing remote workers wouldn't even have entered into the picture. We wouldn't even have asked the question because it was so far out of the scope of the CFO. And the idea of driving business strategy and objectives would probably have come out well above these numbers, probably around the 40% mark. Instead, what we've seen is suddenly managing remote workers represents this dramatic shift. So for the past 5 years or so, even 10 years, the CFO's changing role has been primarily around the role that they play in business strategy. So when you see managing remote workers suddenly leaping out, you realize that there's been a fundamental shift in the role of the CFO. And this idea of managing remote workers therefore represents the single biggest shift that we've seen in the past decade and the most unexpected shift. And that tells us also the dramatic impact that COVID-19 has had on the CFO and on their new roles. So we're going to see their roles continue to evolve. This will become a standard part of their role. And over the next couple of years, you'll probably see that second one, driving business strategy, again, moving to the fore, because it will no longer be a case of competing with managing remote workers, but rather a standard part of their role. So this audience pretty much reflects what we find in our research among CFOs. But now look at the other two numbers, the impact of COVID-19 on the business. 44% said that it had actually increased demand for their services as CFOs. In other words, the CFO has moved more critically to the center of the business. And that also, to some extent, reflects the responses of this audience to the previous question, because it shows how important the CFO is in helping organizations to deal with the crisis. And 78%, massive, almost 8 out of 10, reported revenue growth in recent months. And that was largely attributable to the fact that they were already digitally transformed or on the way to digital transformation. And they were able to take advantage of the digital nature of their department and of the organization to help continued revenue growth. And then here is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, is how technology really had a direct impact on the role and the performance of the finance department and the CFO. 2/3 of CFOs said that they no longer spend most of their time gathering and processing data. They are now spending more time analyzing their data rather than processing it. This puts us well ahead of the same group of respondents, or the same category of respondents in the United Kingdom, where the survey was also conducted, and only 50% said they were spending more time analyzing data. This reflects the extent to which South African organizations tend to embrace technology because they need that edge. They need to use some kind of tool or differentiator to cope with a weakened economy. And we've had that weakened economy for the past 5 years or so as a result of various structural factors. So the pandemic hasn't suddenly made people wake up to the fact that they need to find a way to cope. We've had to cope all along, whereas in the UK, they're only now suddenly having to cope with these massive demands. So 2/3 are becoming, you could say, futurists in terms of analyzing the data and looking to see what it means for the future. Now, the other two numbers here are highly significant. 82% say that financial management technologies have uncovered efficiencies in the business, allowing them to optimize their operations. So efficiency has been the single biggest benefit of utilizing new technology. And 66% of financial decision makers said that data analytics was being used to drive productivity in finance. So productivity and efficiency as a result of having more time to analyze rather than just collect data.
Thanks, Arthur. I just want to take a brief moment to pause here. And Gerhard, I'm going to ask you to jump on camera. Never mind, you just did. And I want to get some of your insights, Gerhard, just based on what we're looking at here and some of the trends and the patterns that we're seeing when we do a comparison between the UK, which is obviously a much more kind of stable and emerged market than South Africa is. I know that you interact with various different finance executives, CFOs and FDs and business leaders on a regular basis of both sort of medium and kind of large enterprises. I'm really interested to hear what are some of the things that you've noticed. I mean, how are conversations shifting? Are we seeing a change in behavior just based on the year that we've had and during the COVID pandemic? And perhaps you could share some examples with us.
Good morning, everyone. And John, thanks for having this session. And I mean, obviously, Arthur said, like you said, hit the rubber where the road is. And I think very importantly, good morning to all the audience. I see we've got 95 participants, and it's great to be part of the conversation. And I think to the question, I want to break it up in two parts. I think very importantly, before the pandemic, let's say before the end of March, how did finance leaders and CFOs looked at their business? And then after that, how did finance leaders during the pandemic look at their business? And I think we're touching on subjects that's always been there. I mean, digital transformation. It's something that a lot of businesses has always talked about or aspired to. But if we look at the research and let's call it the research that Sage done, we could see that companies that invested in technology, we talked about the workforce having remote teams. Now, if you invested in technology, let's say gearing your business already to have remote teams in place, you went through that learning curve, you've embraced technology to give you better insight into your business. I mean, obviously you were set up already to operate like that. And the companies that made that shift were obviously during this phase of the pandemic were geared to perform. And I mean, we saw it in in the stats that Arthur just shared with us. We saw that some companies could report and say, oh, but you know what, I've seen an increase, whether it's managing my customers, whether it's managing my supply chain, and whether it's managing my insights of the business. And they were very fortunate. But what the pandemic forced us to do is it created a spark. I'm going to call it a spark, because it gave finance leaders and CFOs the reset button to say, if we are faced with these big challenges in business, and not to single out just the pandemic, but if I'm faced with challenges, how do we adopt? What do we need to put in place in our strategy to make sure we're relevant? And I mean, again, from the poll this morning, it came out two things. One, on the financial management side, the insight of the business, working with the workforce. Now, if we go, and I'm going to use two examples. Let's take the manufacturing industry. They were in total shutdown. And all of a sudden, you've got a disconnect between running your business and your workforce, which you never had before. So how do you link the two? What did these companies need to do to bring these two, I want to say, poles together? And immediately they started looking at technology, whether it's using platforms like we're using to have remote sessions, to do check-ins, to make sure that critical business functions are still running. Again, when they adopted that technology, you can see the change in the workforce. But you also sit, if you take the manufacturing, for instance, you sit with a workforce that needs to be within the factory, manufacturing the products. And there again, you can ask, but how do you embrace technology there? And there it was to see, are there processes, again, within our company we can streamline better when it comes to manufacturing our products? Because we're in shutdown, we can't sell what we've sold before. Can we reinvent ourselves and all of a sudden, let's say, start selling protective equipment? We've got those examples within those industries of how quickly companies evolved to address a need in the market, and that's super. And I mean, Arthur touched on the South African market versus the UK market, and I think in the South African market, which makes us so unique and agile, is we're not always just faced with, let's call it the pandemic, COVID we had, but there's numerous other challenges, whether it's load shedding, whether it's maybe changes in legislation that takes place. And you need to be geared to get those changes in action for your business. So I want to say the finance leaders are used to disruption. I think the question was, how did we adapt this time around to disruption? And same in the healthcare. Massive disruption to say, listen, we need to gear ourselves for influx of let's say, patients that could potentially be ill versus treating normal run-of-the-mill cases. And again, where companies made the investment before to say managing workforce, managing operations, they could make that shift quite fast. And that's the beauty for me about this research. And having these conversations with customers is to see some of them learn before and some of them learn during the past 6 months. But looking into the future, we're going to see a lot of agile decisions, leaders geared, specifically finance leaders and CFOs that are geared to question the strategy. And I firmly believe from the word go that these leaders are always part of the decision of where the company is going.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Gerhard. Arthur, I see you've popped back on there. Is there something you'd like to add to that?
No, those are fascinating insights, which leads us beautifully into the next couple of slides. Gerhard, do you want to comment on the digital culture champions? Because that's really what you were talking about now, before I talk about just how significant these numbers are.
Yeah, thanks, Arthur. And again, like I said earlier on, we've seen digital, let's call them digital leaders, financial leaders that looked at how can we better optimize? What must we do to gear ourselves for technology changes? And it's not about just the change as a once-off. I mean, we all know that technology changes on a daily basis. So there it's important to look at how am I gearing myself to have longevity? What is the future looking? What is the trends in our business I need to adhere to? And again, if we look at the polls, the financial analysis, we saw it in the feedback. How can we do forward looking? How can we do predictions? How can we manage the workforce? And that digital leader needs to make sure that they can answer those questions back to the business.
Gerhard, there was actually a great question that was asked now in the chat room by Donald Elliott about the company consisting of CAs, actuaries, data scientists, and software specialists, but that CFOs are reluctant to embrace technology to assist to drive business strategy. This slide actually talks about the flip side of that. The answer is really to show these CFOs just how far behind the curve they are and the extent to which that is going to leave them behind their competition. Because 89%, that's 9 out of 10 CFOs are welcoming automation for the reasons that both of us have just been discussing, because it makes them that much more efficient. It's because it allows them to focus on business objectives rather than just routine tasks day to day. And that 73% is an incredibly encouraging statistic for anyone involved in financial technology, because what it means is that 3/4 of CFOs are saying, we've seen how well it works and we want more, bring it on. In other words, there isn't this reluctance or resistance. Yes, there is amongst a small proportion, the 1 in 10, the 11% who don't welcome automation, but they are really going to be caught behind the curve, and they'll be victims of history rather than riding the wave of history.
Yeah, I just want to rope Gerhard back in here again. And Gerhard, again, with all the interactions that you have with various different finance executives and around the culture, around the topic of culture, I'm interested to see that now that finance professionals are operating more efficiently, we've got real-time analytics, we're forward-looking. What does it mean for the relationships both in the executive suite, around now the CFO's more strategic ability and capability, and just what it's done to the overall culture and the relationships with other stakeholders in the business and, of course, the C-suite?
So to answer that, I'll give you a two-folded answer. Yeah. I think the first thing is when you as a CFO or finance leader goes on this journey, it's the start of a journey. I think Arthur immediately touched on this now to say some are reluctant and some are ready to go. But you need to make the decision to say, listen, I want to progress. And by progressing is to say there's change that needs to happen. There's a spark that you're going to need to ignite in your business to get this going. And as a financial leader, I firmly believe that sits with the CFO as well as the CIO, or let's call it the technology leaders within the business. But I also think it's important that you ask yourself and do a bit of reflection of how can we be more efficient? What can we do to add more value, whether it's to our customers or to our supply chain? And then I think there's 4 questions that you can ask yourself as a financial leader. And that's, what business problems are you trying to solve? What specific technology do you need to solve that problem? Do you have current technology that you can leverage of that and not just bring in to your point of workforce, not changing technology has an influence on managing teams. And then also, what are the new technologies that are available for future looking? So again, to come back to the change, remote teams, the workforce, that's the most difficult thing for anybody is change. So whether you bring in a new technology or you're changing your business processes, individuals, the workforce, the teams will immediately sit back and say, oh, but what does this change mean? So again, for the CIO, the CFO, playing those roles to do the investigations, to do the motivations of why the shift, they need to look down as well and say, it's not just the technology, but it's the workforce as well. How do I get someone to adapt to work just as productively, let's call it virtually or from home, because we can't access our offices, versus we always were in an office, face to face, could walk around the corner, speak to one another, soundboard something. It's not there. So it's really important to take your workforce, your leaders, your people performing these functions on a daily basis together on this journey. Otherwise, you're not going to be successful. You can leverage and bring in any type of technology into your organization, but if you don't have leaders or colleagues embracing it, you're going to fail.
It's an interesting concept, and I'm sure you've had a similar experience over at Sage, and both with the finance executive there that you speak to. And although there is definitely value in bumping into someone at the water cooler even, or in the kitchen, and being able to kind of bounce those ideas and have those impromptu sort of conversations, don't you find that if we've got the correct technology and the correct platforms, we're having more of those conversations now, and perhaps a little bit more deliberate and a little bit more strategically now as well?
Yes, 100%. And I think very importantly is, as organization, you talk about these engagements, these strategy sessions we need to do. And while working virtually, that needs to become part of your daily operations. You need to schedule these interactions. It's not just, I want to say, it's good that if it can be an interaction where you can see faces. It's good to have regular check-ins to make sure that you keep on aligning, because the business changes. The business, for a lot of these customers that we engage with, we saw the journey they took while during COVID, and it was hard. But looking back today, they did the right engagement with their workforce. They did the research on the longevity of their technology they want to put in place. And it sounds simple, but it is challenging times. It was challenging times for them. But the success, if you tasted success, if you can back to the two questions, if you can get that managing and leading your remote team spot on with your analysis and forward looking, it's really a powerful combination.
Yeah.
And again, there I think I want to encourage the financial leaders to take that step. We had the comment earlier on to say, but should we not? It's difficult change, but take that step. Don't be afraid. Speak to everyone on the call probably knows one another, same industry, same vertical, same type of maybe company, but have those engagements. I think it's important that we share knowledge, that it's not just isolated pockets of interactions that takes place. These type of forums, John, I think is ideal to unpack these challenges, and a learning culture makes us even so more successful.
100%. Thanks, Gerhard.
Thanks, Gerhard. Talking about the changing role of the CFO and also leveraging the technology, that is really the key research finding of CFO 3.0, is that the role is evolving at a significant pace, even for those who don't realize it is, even for those who are holding back technology. The demands on them of a crisis like COVID-19 is that they find ways of ensuring the business is sustainable. So business continuity is not just a question of carrying on with collecting the data. It's what you do with that data in order to ensure continuity into the future. And that is why that second key finding is also so significant, that CFOs are playing a central role in managing uncertainty, risk, and compliance. But it's that uncertainty that is addressed by the use of technology. The more you have a finger on the pulse of what's happening in the business and the business environment, the more you can manage that uncertainty. You can't do away with uncertainty, but you can manage it with the use of technology. And CFOs are confident that finance technology is going to help them unlock new levels of opportunity that hasn't been tapped in the past. So what you saw earlier with automation assisting with efficiency, that's just one part of the equation. What comes next is where they leverage technologies like artificial intelligence that will help them analyze data on the fly, as it were, to tell them what they ought to be doing next, not necessarily to instruct them, but rather to guide them and to help them make those decisions. And this really sums up that shift and that evolution. So CFO 1.0 is your traditional financial manager, you might even say, although they still called him the chief financial officer. But the chief financial officer of the past was one who was concerned with the historic picture of the business, was concerned with producing those annual reports that showed how the business performed over the past year. And it's that kind of focus that leads a lot of investors, for example, to base their investment decisions on past trends instead of understanding what is happening now and what is going to happen in the future. And as we know, basing the future on history is often a very short-sighted approach. That led to what we are now seeing as a fairly widespread approach. The CFO 2.0 is the current CFO who's the real-time analyst of what is happening in the organization, has access to typically a dashboard of information where they can click a button and say, this is exactly the status of the organization, this is where we are with sales, this is where we are on return of assets and the like, and can give you an instant picture of where the business is at. If you as a CFO haven't evolved from being the historian to being the real-time analyst, you are definitely behind the curve. It also means that you're going to have more difficulty moving to that next step. And that again comes back to that question that was posed earlier. Those who are resisting technology and resisting change, typically they're still stuck in that historian mold and are having difficulty moving to being the real-time analyst. But what comes next, CFO 3.0, the visionary who can look into the future, is going to truly put into perspective how far behind the historian is. And it's that 1 in 10 I spoke about earlier, who are still historians and like the role of the historian. The problem is the historian isn't helping the business to survive during crisis times. The historian can only tell the business what it did in the past. And there was a time when that was adequate, but today that is utterly inadequate because you have to be at least the real-time analyst, but to truly serve the business as a whole and to play a role in business strategy, you have to be the visionary who is able to use the tools and the technologies that allow the business to look into the future, to manage uncertainty, and to cope with change. Not to only cope with change, but actually thrive in a time of change. And with that, we're going to move to the next survey, where we're going to ask you to tell us which technologies you think offer the greatest potential for finance leaders to accelerate digital transformation. So first is just automation, basic automation that allows you to become more efficient. Perhaps the role of CFO 2.0, the real-time analyst. There's artificial intelligence that allows for predictive analytics. That's CFO 3.0, the visionary. And then there's machine learning that allows your systems to learn from the data that has been input and that's being analyzed, and to keep improving itself. Perhaps that's a more futuristic approach. So of those three, which do you think has the greatest potential in your department to accelerate digital transformation?
You can see some of those results coming in, so I'll give you a little bit more time to respond there. You can see there's clearly a front runner there. Sure. Starting to sway ever so slightly. Wow, okay. We've definitely got a mixed group of finance professionals here today. It was really swaying in the one particular direction, and it's come down drastically now. Okay, we'll give you about another 5 seconds. If you haven't responded, you can still go ahead and do so now. And then Gerhard, I'm going to rope you back in for some of your insights on this. So yeah, let's go ahead and close that poll now. So you can see the poll results over on the right-hand side of our screen there. For those of us in the audience, you should see them displayed over your chat. And what are some of your observations based on that, Gerhard? And then we'll come to you next, Arthur.
Yeah, I actually had a look at some of the questions that was posed, but obviously on the polls, it shows you that they want better insight, smarter, predictive analytics. Arthur touched on it, and he said that the managing of the uncertainty is very important. You need financial technology. So as Sage, what we've done during COVID is we've launched a new product. We call it Sage Intact. It helps you specifically. It's a cloud-native solution. It's written by finance leaders for finance leaders, and there one of the great aspects is predictive analytics, insights. I mean, just to touch on one, Donald spoke about in his question. He asked about, or between the two of you, asked about the industries and the verticals, and where do we see the adoption of technology, and we see it within insurance, healthcare, retail. Yes, maybe agricultural can be slower, but there's massive agricultural companies that want these tools. So again, I think it boils down for me to where the maturity of the organization is. I can't talk away that for some verticals or for some smaller companies, it's difficult to make this change. It's difficult to break down those walls. But it's important, as I said earlier, knock on that door, keep on knocking. Expose these firms or companies to more information. I know that we had a question from Sarah asking about, but it's not just the operations and the technical side, but how do we get the voice of the finance leader into the corridor, into the room, that companies can understand that it's not just one aspect that's being influenced, it's the entire company. And again there, Sarah, my recommendation will be speak to your leaders or your co-leaders on this. Use usable references to say, but look at this company in a particular industry, made the shift, look at their successes. Because those success stories are tangible stories. I can go and tell you many, many more stories about companies just during this period that embraced on technology. They got it implemented, they got it executed, it's operational. It's not a myth, it's operational. It gives them that insight. And all of that was done remotely, whether it's training colleagues, whether it's putting the software down, getting it operational in the business. So it shows us it can be done. And I think that's the beauty, is that if you make that shift and you're determined to be successful on this journey, you will be.
Thanks, Gerhard.
Thanks, Gerhard. I'll give you a more technology-oriented response to this, and that is to say that almost half of this particular audience sees artificial intelligence as playing the most significant role. But that's not to discount those who see automation as critical. 38% is still a very high proportion. And what it represents is those people who can see the immediate benefits of automation and how that can improve their current performance and their current role in the organization. And you combine that with those who see the potential for future shifts in their role using artificial intelligence. The one that comes out lowest is machine learning. And that is because it is still not clear how it changes the role of the CFO. There are use cases, but they're not obvious. It's not what you would call a no-brainer, whereas automation is an absolute no-brainer, and artificial intelligence will be the next no-brainer. So it's, I would say, a fairly predictable outcome, but I would probably have expected a higher proportion of people to go for automation because it is so immediately obvious and already in use by so many of you.
Thanks, Arthur.
And in conclusion, that ushers in the era of CFO 3.0. The fact that half of you see artificial intelligence as the next big thing means that at least half of you are prepared for the era of CFO 3.0. I'm sure all of you are, but in terms of having a clear perspective on becoming the visionary, at least half of you are there. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur. Thank you so much. And while we're waiting for a couple of those questions to come in on the chat, so remember, just go ahead and type your questions in the chat and let us know if you'd like either Arthur or Gerhard to address them. Some of the questions we received in the build-up to this webinar and in the pre-registration, the question was from Israel Klachwayo, who's asking, what will the new role for accountants be? So we've spoken about this transition from CFO 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0. So where does that leave us as finance professionals and accountants? How do we see that kind of evolving and morphing?
So,
sorry,
Arthur, you go.
From our side, it's very clear that the accountant, the chief financial officer, has to be able to look into the crystal ball. They have to be able to use predictive analytics in this future. Gerhard?
Yeah, I mean, it's if you ask how the role will change, I think it starts with the education of accountants. It starts with the curriculums that are changed to make sure that they gear these leaders for the future. If you think about, I mean, I'm going to use myself as an example. About 25 years ago, I studied BCom accounting. I mean, I went through the entire process. And again, if you compare that curriculum to what's happening today, just the investment that the industry is making into finance leaders is critical. Because for finance leaders, whether it's accountant, finance leader, a CFO, you need to be geared to give your customers the best advice, whether it's internal customers, your organization, or maybe if you provide a service to external companies to say, where's this going? And to Arthur's point, predictive analytics, compliance, making sure you understand technology to use it to the fullest. I think a lot of times people are using technology platforms, but the one crucial part is the data you put into the system can just be as accurate. It needs to be very, very accurate, because otherwise your predictions and your analytics you want to make and into the future is going to be inaccurate. So it's not just about the technology, putting it down into the company, but managing those data correctly. Because if that's done, you're going to get your outcome, which is your predictive analytics, your artificial intelligence that you want to use, etc. So it's key. And you're asking about the accountant role. A lot of times they're responsible for making sure the data is trusted. The data is compliant. The data can be used. So it's a very important point that you make sure data is compliant within your company as well.
Okay.
And trust.
And trust.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. A couple more questions. So, Arthur, I've got a very, very serious question for you that I think a lot of the audience are wondering themselves, and then I'm going to open the floor back up to the two of you for my second question. So, the difficult question for you, Arthur, is that a green screen behind you, or is that a legitimate bookshelf?
Well, the only way to prove it is to take out my own book from the shelf.
Perfect. It was one of the questions that came up earlier on. I think it might have been Donald who touched on this earlier, and it was about that we can call it maybe fear or a bit of resistance to finance leaders with adopting technology. And you probably would have seen yourselves in the start of lockdown, there was that meme doing the rounds that said something along the lines of who was responsible for leading digital transformation in your organization. And the options were the CEO, the CFO, the CIO, or the COVID pandemic. And we all know which way that went. So I'm interested to hear from the two of you, what suggestions or advice have you got for finance leaders who are maybe struggling to embrace and adopt this change and technology? You both are right now. So let's start with you, Gerhard, and then we'll come to Arthur.
Okay, good. So I think the first thing I want to say is if you haven't made the switch or you haven't started the journey to look at how you can embrace technology, it's never too late. There's never a cutting point to say you should have started 6 months ago, etc. Yes, if you compare yourself, you can maybe see your competitors being more successful. That's definitely happening. But I think what's important is start it. And don't make it this, I want to say, make it simple. I think we always try to make it very complex, but start on a simple process and say, like I said earlier on, what is the problem you want to fix? Maybe you've got technology. Do you want to fix a data problem? Do you want to fix an insights problem? Do you want to fix a trending problem? Because you're going to get different answers. If you've got nothing in place, and let's call it you run a manual environment, then obviously to unpack that, you're going to need more detail to support that project. But if you've got some sort of technology, ask the question, what do I want to solve? What do I need? Is it sufficient? Do I need to add on some solutions? Out of the survey, it came out, again, the predictive analytics. If I look at the people and the names and the companies that they work for, I'm sure that you've got some sort of technology within your company you're using. But somewhere, if you ask a question, what is the problem? What do I need? What do I need to evolve more? You're going to get that solution. And then let's make sure you're getting a provider that can solve that for you. And then again, looking into the future, whatever you do now needs to be sustainable. It needs to be, you don't just want to make an investment for 12 or 24 months. You at least want to make sure that you get your return on it over many, many years. But part of that investment is to re-look it. Don't just leave it. It needs servicing. It needs constant review because business, competitors, industries are changing. So whatever you've invested in is maybe relevant. You just need to freshen it up a bit to make sure that it sustains those I want to say business objectives you want to achieve.
Thanks. Arthur, anything you'd add to that?
Yes, I want to refer to a graph or a curve that the International Data Corporation, the IDC, created to show what the shape of the next year to two is going to be. And it shows an reverse or an upside down bell curve, starting with the beginning of the pandemic and the demands it makes on business for business survival. Then it goes down the curve into the depths of the expected recession that we're already in, but it's going to get worse, as we know. And during that period, the focus is going to be on business resilience. And then coming up that curve, there's going to be a massive focus on business recovery. Of course, everyone is already talking about recovery, but it's probably premature in terms of the economy as a whole, but it will come. And as we move up that curve of recovery, then business recovery becomes a critical element of it as well. But when we come out the other side, there's going to be a period where we're going to see massive returns to profit, but it's going to be driven by one word, and that word is digital. It's the companies that are fully digital that will thrive, that will have the most dramatic recoveries and returns to profit, and that will also dominate their markets. And if you're not fully digital by the time we come out of this crisis, then you will still remain inside the crisis well beyond the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. I've got two more questions. I see we are fast approaching the top of the hour. So the first one is for you, Arthur, and then I'm going to come to you next, Gerhard. So Arthur, if you were to conduct the same research or the same sort of survey today, do you think the results would be any different?
Yes, I think that we'll find a lot more people, a lot more CFOs will be engaged in remote working, and a lot more CFOs will have used more advanced technologies. And I think that appetite for more automation, where we saw 73% of respondents saying they're ready for more, I think that will increase because of the growing awareness that you need those kind of tools. And especially in a world of remote working, automation becomes a critical tool for managing not just people, but processes as well.
Sure. Thanks, Arthur. And then, Gerhard, just to kind of close off today's session with a large group of aspirational finance professionals and a large group of already very successful finance professionals and senior CFOs and FDs, what advice or what suggestions have you got for them based on both the research and on conversations you're having and what you've seen throughout your career and journey?
So I think very importantly is what the research showed us, that there's a journey, there's a need. And I want to encourage everyone to really look at that need. Make sure that the technology you invest in is really there to support your business. I think what's also important, we saw it, and I just quickly look at the chat again, we saw Donald to say, but listen guys, we're struggling to get through to certain CFOs. And I think it's important there, Donald. For me it is, you can never not knock on the door. Yes, there's resistance to change always. But I think what's important is the finance leaders, in conjunction with other leaders in the organization, need to collectively make the decision. This is where we're moving towards. As Arthur said, if we look into the future and we see what's happening with the pandemic, how do you need to gear yourself? It shows us you need to digitalize. For each company, that's a different meaning. But again, from a Sage perspective, and you saw the customers, and some of you on this call are customers of ours as well. Speak to us. Let us help you. Let us take you on this journey to make sure your businesses are geared for the future. And I think also it's important that the research that was shared, all of that by Arthur, I mean, obviously, John, we're going to be able to give it through to the audience, but I think it's important if they want to reach out to me, maybe individual questions. Everyone on the call, you're more than welcome to do so. But for us, it's to make sure we help organizations to gear themselves to be sustainable, to gear themselves to be even more successful, which they are at. And I know it's been a hard journey. But what we've seen from a Sage side, there is a recovery happening. Some industries slower than others, but the engagement is there from customers asking us, how can we help us move to a certain state, whether it's remote workforce, whether it's managing businesses remotely. All of that is part of the value proposition with our software.
Nice. Thanks, Gerhard. And on that very positive note, I want to thank Arthur. Thank you very much for sharing your insights and the really extensive research that you undertook around CFO 3.0. And I find it really insightful and interesting, and I've no doubt that the rest of the CFO community found the same. Gerhard, thank you very much for sharing those examples with us on what you've seen out in the marketplace and how we can relate this research back to real life examples, and most importantly, what we can do to become more successful in our roles as finance professionals as well. And one of the things that we can do over at CFO South Africa to assist you on that journey is through continuous development and learning. So you'll see our next webinar is scheduled for the 17th of September, and we'll be discussing liquidity management with the crew over from Nedbank. So join us for that session on the 17th of September. And then today marks a very important date in the calendar as well. So we are exactly 1 month away from the all-new virtual Finance Indaba. If you haven't registered already, you're definitely missing out. So I'm going to go ahead and type that link in the chat now. So go ahead and click on that link in the chat. You'll be able to register for the all-new virtual Finance Indaba. The latest edition of CFO magazine has also just been published, so you can download that on our website as well. And I'll give you a link where you can do that. And then lastly, for any of our upcoming events, you can go ahead and register at cfo.co.za/events. And I'm putting the link in the chat as well. And at this point, I'd like to thank the CFO community for your ongoing positive contributions, for being here today, and for just helping the finance profession move forward in a more positive direction. So thank you all for being here. Looking forward to seeing you on the 17th of September. And don't forget to register for the Finance Indaba. We'll see you back soon. Thanks, and have a great end to the day. Thanks, Gerhard. Thanks, Arthur.
Thank you.
All right. Cheers, everybody. Cheers, cheers.
Thanks, everyone.